Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bad Luck Gamer, and today I'm going to be talking to you about what has me so incredibly hyped for the Cosmere RPG, especially when it comes to combat. I am someone who doesn't like to be given power by the games. I don't like playing super broken builds. I'm just not someone who really enjoys crushing a game. I want to feel like I earn it. I want to feel like the story is reacting to my success. And that's exactly what the Cosmere RPG has been doing for me and my friends when we've been playing. We actually just got done playing the other day, and it was incredibly fun with a very in-depth combat. And the whole thing that made it happen is this game rewards your ability to tell a really good story, your narrative skill, your ability to think in dynamic and interesting ways in combat is actually paid forward by the system, giving you new opportunities and new things you can utilize in the game and can give you a very strong edge if you're particularly good at it. TTRPGs, for the most part, are not particularly skill-based. Sure, a talent for strategy and a talent for some of the more in-depth games really can get you there, but a lot of that is just, are you using the right spell? Are you using the right attack? Do you have the right build? This game is not about that. There's not really a right build when it comes to combat. It's, are you telling a good enough story? And that is something I like. But don't get me wrong. There are tons of mechanics to back everything up. And if you want to make a very combat savvy character, you definitely can. The Cosmere RPG is going to feel very familiar to many people when it comes to its base mechanics. It's very inspired by D&D. I mean, it's a D20 based system, and Dungeons and Dragons is the grandfather of D20 systems, really. But it has a lot of the same things that if you are someone who play D&D, then you're going to very much pick up this game real fast. I mean, the basics are there. When you're making an attack roll, you're going to roll a D20, add whatever appropriate stat and skill modifier to the check. With a little bit of a difference that there's no base like attack modifier in this game, no base proficiency. Instead, you actually invest skill ranks into a combat skill like light weapons or heavy weapons that you can use to then make your attack rolls. And an additional twist, that skill modifier is actually directly tied to how much damage you do with that weapon. So a really good example I'll give here is if you're using a knife. It's a light weapon, which uses your speed trait. So you're going to roll a d20 plus your speed trait plus your light weapon ranks to get your attack result. And your damage result is going to use the knife's damage, which is a d4 keen, which is slashing and piercing damage in this game, plus your entire modifier for that check. So if you are rolling at max at level 1 plus 5, then you're going to get plus 5 more damage onto that D4, which is really, really cool. It means that your skill with the weapon determines how much damage you're going to do. And so combat characters are more than likely going to be investing as much as they can into their combat-related traits. And this system also is very similar to Pathfinder 2nd Edition, the game that's really made the 3-action system its own. Sure, D&D technically has a 3-action system with the move, standard, and bonus action, but Pathfinder gives you the freedom to choose whatever you want with those 3 actions, and the Cosmere RPG does the same thing, but a little bit more differently. Sure, you spend an action to move, spend an action to strike, but there's 2 different types of initiative here that give you either 2 actions or 3 actions, depending on if you decide to go fast or slow. Fast characters will go before the slow characters, meaning that if you want to get an enemy down quickly or do something before they have a chance to act, you're going to want to move fast. But if you want a turn that has more actions, more things you're going to do, then you're going to want to go slow. And when it comes to a game about balancing action economy, then it feels very impactful to have more choice over how that works in particular. And there's a variety of other things that I'm not going to get to in this video that can alter how this overall works, but it's really cool. And speaking on initiative systems for this game as well, this is a players go first system. So all players of each bracket of initiative, so all fast players will go before all fast NPCs, and then all slow players will go before all slow NPCs. Now, some of you might be like, well, then that weighs things more in the player's favor. Yes, this game is very much weighed in the player's favor. It's a system that the GM can at any time introduce new threats and new enemies and can throw difficult combats. And with the combat my group had last night, it was a very close battle. Let's be honest. I'll tell you more about the battle here in a little bit, but I want to kind of get the basics out so you know exactly what I'm talking about. So yeah, it's weighted in the player's favor. The players have a lot more agency over the combat. They can work together. And this combat system actually very much motivates players to work together. That the biggest reason being the advantage-disadvantage system. If you're familiar with D&D 5e, the advantage-disadvantage system is one of those systems that like everyone knows, and a lot of people really like it. I like it too, even though it kind of makes the math a little bit harder to track. When the expectation is that every character is kind of getting advantage as much as possible, then it's something where it's not really a balancing factor when everyone's making use of it, as it were. So when you roll, you can roll twice, take the better result. But advantage is not only just for your attack rolls. If you gain advantage on a particular skill check, you can actually use that advantage for your damage dice instead, or even rolling the plot die instead. So if you are sure you're going to hit, you don't really need the advantage 2 hits. The enemy is just very debuffed or whatever. You can take that advantage instead onto your die for your damage dice, and you can ensure that or at least improve the chance of doing more damage to the enemy. And with a game like this, where there is a deflect value that essentially reduces the damage you deal rather than armor improving your defenses, that is something that is very important to be able to deal a lot of damage. And armor, that's another part of this system I really like as well, is very impactful because armor doesn't increase your ability to be hit or not be hit. Instead, armor just reduces damage straight out. So it's very motivating for players to wear armor, but that is going to limit how your character is going to be able to build in certain ways. Armor has lots of strength requirements, and some of the heaviest armors you can't even wear at the beginning of the game without taking penalties. So with that being said, it's definitely a player's choice, and fast characters not only just use light weapons, but they move faster as well. Your speed trait literally translates to how much your character can move. So it's not a trait you should ignore as an armor wielding character, which again makes it more difficult for your character to hyper invest into might. And since the entire skill rank for your weapon applies to your damage rather than just a stat, might is not necessarily better than speed when it comes to dealing damage with weapons, except for the fact that might weapons tend to be heavier and deal more base damage. But many of them are also two-handed, which limits some of the options that player may have as well. So there's a lot of dynamics. The system goes incredibly deep, and it's a very strategic system. And I guess 10 minutes into the video, this is a very weird time to make mention of this, but the Cosmere RPG is an advanced TTRPG, especially when it comes to combat. Not only is there a deep level of strategy in the system, but your narrative skill, your ability to tell an interesting story, very much determines how your character is able to perform, what kind of opportunities you have, and as well, something that I really, really like about this game is your ability as a role player is very much weighted in this system, which I absolutely love. And now some of you are probably very interested in what this game actually offers. This isn't a standard fantasy-based system. There's no wizards. There are fighters, technically, they're warriors, and there are technically rogues as agents, but there's not very much your standard affair. And not only that, but this is a predominantly human-based system. Of course, there's also the singers, but I'm not going to get into that in this video. So your ancestry doesn't necessarily play as big of a factor when it comes to your overall stats. That doesn't sound as exciting. I mean, what is a fantasy game without wizards and magic items and stuff like that? Well, the Cosmere RPG is exciting because your character is someone you can visualize easily. It's not just some imaginary ancestry, some imaginary magic system that is loosely balanced. Everything has reason and logic behind it and feels really good and very impactful. And not only that, but your various talents, which we'll talk about here in a moment, will very much determine how your character even approaches combat. Every character is going to play slightly different in combat, and that's incredibly fun. So I mentioned the paths, right? There are heroic paths in this system that change essentially what your character's overall skill set are. And not all of them are necessarily combat focused, but we'll take a look at some of the warrior stuff here just so you can get a gist of what being a actual combat character is like. So the warrior currently in the beta has two subpaths. We have the soldier and we have the duelist. The soldier is just the basic fighting heroic path, and the duelist is more focused on one-on-one combat. Now, one of the biggest things that I really like about the soldier path is combat training. Combat training is such a great talent because it gives you weapon expertise and armor expertise, something I'll talk about here in a little bit. But it also makes it where you graze the enemy for free every combat. And grazing is very interesting because normally you need to spend focus, and this focus point allows you to deal damage to an enemy even if you miss. But with combat training, you don't even need to spend that focus point. And focus points, just so you know, are like your character's stamina. They allow you to do specific actions, and there's a lot of actions based on using focus. A lot more I'll talk about in a bit, but graze is one of the more used options because even if you miss, it allows you to deal damage to an enemy based on the damage die of that weapon that you're using. So bigger weapons graze for a lot more damage. And with the soldier path here giving us the free ability to do so, meaning we can use more powerful abilities elsewhere, while also, even if we miss, continuously dealing damage, continuously bringing the fight closer and closer towards its end. And that's absolutely huge. It's really, really awesome. And many of the talents feel just as impactful. You can pick up combat training as early as level 1 with the humans who get an additional talent. Now, I should mention that grazing, while great, does lose some of its value over the course of a campaign, mostly because this game has scaling health. Every time you level up, at least for the first 5 levels, you get 5 HP, and the enemies roughly get the same. And after that, even, you get a little bit less and a little bit less, but your HP is constantly scaling, but weapon damage doesn't necessarily scale in the same way. So your grazes will be less and less effective as you level up. But this is because there are many other ways that this combat system kind of makes up the difference. And there are ways you can deal more damage to kind of help this. So the combat training giving you a free graze, really all it does is allows you to continue grazing into later parts of the game where other characters are not going to want to use the graze action because that focus point can typically be spent in other places to much more effect. But for soldiers or anyone who is going down the warrior path or even the hunter path, which also gets combat training, you will be able to essentially be able to do consistent damage in a way that other characters really can't. But speaking on other abilities that allow you to do extra damage, after combat training, and as long as your character is at minimum level 6, you can pick up Devastating Blow. Devastating Blow is a 2-action ability that doesn't cost focus, but when you hit, you deal additional damage, starting out at 2d8. And this scales as you get further into the game. Now, the Cosmere RPG uses a tier-based system, and so after every 5 levels, you will go up the next tier. So at level 6, you'll go up to tier 2. At level 11, you'll go up to tier 3, so on and so forth. And every time you tier up, you gain an additional die with Devastating Blow. This is a really great action as it scales with the game being overall effective. And because it doesn't cost focus, again, we have more options as a warrior for other, focus-based actions. And even if this attack misses, we can still graze. Sure, not for the extra damage, but with our weapon damage at the very least. And this game doesn't necessarily focus all the best feats or build ideas in just one single heroic path. All the soldier stuff, true, is really cool, but in order to get Mighty, a incredibly useful ability, especially with Devastating Blow, you're going to need to multipath into either Agent or Hunter. Hunter is probably the one I'd recommend if you're going a full combat build, but Agent can give your character some more unique capabilities and gives you more opportunities to use the plot die, something I'll talk about here in a little bit. The Mighty talent, though, works perfectly with Devastating Blow because whenever you make a weapon or unarmed-based strike, you deal additional damage equal to 1 plus your tier level. And since Devastating Blow is 2 actions, that means Mighty will add at level 6, when you can pick up Devastating Blow, an additional +6 to that damage, just for free without spending any additional focus. So if you want to play the most optimal warrior, you actually do need to multipath into other heroic paths. But not everything is just about dealing as much damage as possible, even though I know that's something a lot of you are out there to do. Let's talk about the Agent a little bit because it does something I absolutely love. The Agent is like the Rogue. You have a lot of different subpaths, more around doing subterfuge or things like thievery than it is actual combat. But as I mentioned before, here you can see you can pick up Mighty as long as you're going down the spy route. And this actually makes a lot of sense because Mighty allows a character who's not necessarily building for combat to stay a little bit more up to pace with combat characters without necessarily giving away a lot of the benefits of the Agent path. But Agent, when you select this path in general, you get Opportunist. Opportunist allows you to re-roll the plot die and keeping the second result. Now, the plot die is very important in this game, and this is where the narrative really comes into effect. So the plot die is used whenever your character is raising the stakes, whenever there is a important moment, which you can invoke with different talents or by your storytelling ability. And the plot die is a D6, and you've probably seen this graph before on my other videos, but this D6 gives you 2 complications, 2 opportunities, and 2 blank sides. Now, the complications means something bad happens, but you get a plus to your roll, either a +2 or +4, which is absolutely huge. And opportunities allow some other benefit, whether you're giving aid to one of your allies or editing the scene so that something beneficial happens. This is where the narrative really leans into the system. And I'll talk a lot more about that in a moment. But what I really want to talk about is with the Agent, it makes the Agent have more control over this. Say you are not necessarily sure you're going to be hitting the enemy. With Opportunist, it allows you to roll the plot die again. So maybe you roll an opportunity, but you're not sure you're going to hit. Well, rather than taking the opportunity, you can reroll again, aiming for a complication. And sure, something bad might happen. New enemies may come into the battlefield or some other kind of negative effect, but you're more likely to hit the enemy. And normally you only raise the stakes when the GM says so. But if you take the risky behavior talent, you can just spend a focus point whenever you make a skill check, which an attack is, to automatically add the plot die, meaning you get to choose when story altering events happen, which is absolutely amazing. And that's not all. Combat, again, is not just about plot die or ensuring that you're going to hit. There's a lot of other really cool things you can do in combat. And in the agent, under the thief path specifically, we have the shadow step. Shadow step allows us to essentially just go invisible right in plain sight. You do some kind of maneuver, some kind of sleight of hand that draws the enemy's attention away, and when they look back, you're gone. You make a thievery check and you spend 2 focus against every enemy who can see you as cognitive defense. And then if you succeed as if you had successfully stealthed in cover, allowing you to, unless you do anything that reveals your position, move without the enemies knowing where you're going. This is absolutely amazing. And sure, it kind of stretches belief in some scenarios. And heck, the GM might even say this probably won't work in this scenario specifically. But there's a lot of situations where this is really cool, and you can gain a huge tactical advantage by just losing the enemy. So the combat is really cool, and every single path currently in the game has different ways that they can be used in combat as well as outside of combat, which is very much awesome. And this is where the whole narrative aspect to the game comes in. As I mentioned before, there's the plot die and how the agent can really manipulate it. But what really makes this game very fun is how you can bend the narrative to gain advantages in combat. And that very much lies in your ability to come up with great opportunities. The opportunity section of the die is not necessarily a statistical result. It will give you something beneficial. For instance, if you're fighting currently in like a kitchen, you might say, hey, can I cut a barrel along with this strike that hits the enemy? And that barrel can ooze like oil or larder onto the ground, creating an opportunity to create an area fire by lighting it ablaze. That's something you can do with an opportunity. Or as well, there are many different talents that use opportunities to do an even greater effect. But more important than any of this, this game has the gain advantage action. This is a one action you can use that will give you potentially advantage on your next skill check and or attack against an enemy. All you have to do is narratively explain how you're using a specific skill against that enemy, and the GM determines what defense that goes against. Now, I mentioned defense a couple times, and I'll explain it a little bit better now. So there are 3 base defenses. There's physical defenses, that anything that affects your character in a physical way or targets a character's physicality, either their strength or their speed. And then there's cognitive defense, which anything revolves around your character's ability to think or to reason. And then there's spiritual defense, which revolves around your character's ability of sense of self and even perceptions, even though most perception-based checks are against your enemy's cognitive defense rather than their spiritual defense, which is something I find very strange because the awareness trait actually is in spiritual, not in cognitive. So I don't know why most checks that go against an enemy's essentially perception goes into cognitive. Maybe that'll change. We're still in beta. That's just one of the weird parts, but regardless, it means it allows you to target enemies in their weak spots with your talents. A combat-based character might also be very tactically minded and might be able to deduce what the enemy might do next in a very strategic way. So you use gain an advantage and you use your deduction against the enemy's cognitive defense. And a slow-witted enemy is very bad at this and becomes predictable, allowing that character to narratively gain an advantage on the enemy by just anticipating what they're going to do, which is really cool. But this is so much deeper than that. There are so many ways your character can use very interesting abilities against your enemies as long as you're great at storytelling. Agility is really good for this. Agility can indicate your character is very fast, very quick, and can slip in behind an enemy's guard when they're not ready. This would be an agility test against their physical defense. which is something you're already kind of targeting, and you might want to target a weakness, but still it's something you could do. But you might instead say, I jump off a chair and I flip over the enemy's head, forcing them to flip around or try to keep track of me. That would be an agility test against their cognitive defense. This is a lot more difficult for the enemy to resist, potentially, depending on their stats, which means one stat can be applied against multiple defenses based on how you narratively do it. And sure, this might lead to a player always asking, hey, can I use my best stat for this particular advantage? And it's up to the GM to arbitrate this. It's unavoidable. If you're going to be doing interesting dynamic things in combat, arbitration is necessary. And as I've said before, this is an advanced TTRPG. So this is for people who are a lot more comfortable with their storytelling ability, and the combat is going to be as intense as the players are good at telling a story. And even if it's not about pure narrative, there are a lot of mechanical things here that really lend itself to the narrative. Two actions in particular I really want to talk about are the aid reaction and the dodge reaction. Both cost a focus point when you use them, so you do need to use these sparingly, or at least as sparingly as you can. But when you use them, it can be to great effect. Aid allows you to aid an ally as long as it's reasonable for you to do so. For instance, if you're flanking an enemy, then you can justify aiding, or just there's a lot of different ways. In fact, if you're a GM of this game, don't limit aid to purely like very strict guidelines. If a player is roughly adjacent to an enemy or can affect them in some way or comes up with a good narrative, allow them to do so. Aid is costly. It costs a focus point to use, so players aren't going to use it necessarily all the time, especially in larger combats. And this whole system is kind of based on the fact that players can get advantage in many different ways. So the aid reaction is really cool, but the best part about it is it motivates your players to work together. Your player is going to be relying on their ally to not only use their reaction, which normally they only get one of, but also to spend a focus point, which is a very precious resource, and this is a very altruistic use of it, because they're not going to be able to use, say, the dodge reaction, which I'll talk about here in a moment. So it requires your players to actively be working together, and it's a trade. One player is putting faith that the other player is going to be doing well by spending their focus point. This creates camaraderie. This creates a lot of interesting moments. And then there's the dodge reaction. The dodge reaction is really cool because it's a reaction that you don't need to set up ahead of time like you do normally in D&D. And sure, it costs a focus point, but it imposes disadvantage on an enemy's attack against them, whether it's ranged or in melee. This disadvantage can be incredibly handy and makes it much less likely that the enemy is about to hit you, which means that this use of a focus point, can potentially save your character's life. But more than that, this allows the players to react in combat in a way that feels very impactful. Active defense is one of those things in many TTRPGs of which more games used, because it gives players a feeling of agency about whether they are hit or not, which is one of those kind of feel bad moments in the game. So this allows the player to at least impose disadvantage and is likely to succeed, though you can't do it repeatedly. So if you're being attacked by multiple enemies, then this is not necessarily going to save that character, but it makes it where the player feels like they can at least struggle a little bit on the way out. And so we're 30 minutes into this video, roughly speaking, and I want to tell you guys about the combat I had just the other night that really made me want to record this video. And since you've been listening for half an hour, I'm sure that you are willing to listen to me talk at this point. But this combat in particular very much solidified my love for this combat system. So we were playing the Bridge 9 one-shot that's currently out, which is really good. I recommend taking a look at it, by the way. But there's this final confrontation, and the players actually had the option to bypass this confrontation, but they chose not to for, honestly, story reasons that would persist outside of the one-shot. My players are very intent on making this into a longer campaign when the game is finally released. Now, I should also make mention of this combat two of my players were scouts, which were, lightly armored military people, and two of them were bridgemen, who were effectively prisoners in little more than rags. So the party wasn't really looking too hot for this coming battle against several pretty heavily armored and armed opponents. But earlier in the one shot, the players had spared and roughly befriended an NPC that decided to help them in this combat, which actually came in handy. The combat started off with a great strategy. The less armored allies were going to run up, try their best to distract the enemies, where the scouts who were in the party, who were good at stealth and moving around, were going to move around and try to get the jump on the enemy when they weren't expecting it, striking them where they're more vulnerable. The enemy team had an archer that the players really wanted to deal with. It kind of worked, but not the way the players expected. The two bridgemen ran up, dove to the ground to avoid getting shot by arrows, surprising the enemy, and the players knew the enemy were surprised. So they weren't necessarily going to get rocked right away. The enemies had less actions and would move slow. So they figured, hey, we'll defend ourselves against the archer, draw the enemies in towards us. And while this was all happening, the enemies came in and the other players started stealthing around. Things were going good, kind of, at first. Then the plan kind of fell apart real quick when the players realized that the enemies are designed to work in pairs, and the two bulky enemies that were running up front were really good at working together in a way that the players were not expecting. This gave them a sheer advantage, and before the players could even get up off the ground, the melee combatants came in and one-shot both of the bridgemen. They were instantly knocked unconscious. Now, this created a lot of stress. Now, their little warrior buddy who they brought along did his best to kind of fight off the enemies, but he was looking like he was going to get into a world of hurt. Now, the other two allies saw this and they're like, oh, what do we do? One of them went after the archer, and the other one decided to move up and help the two bridgemen who were down. Now, one of the cool things about the Cosmere RPG is when you go unconscious, that's not necessarily the end of it. You can always, at the end of one of your turns, regain consciousness and gain 1 HP back, though this is limited by injuries. Whenever a character goes down to 0 HP or another thing, like a deadly weapon strikes them, they have to roll on the injury table. The injury table is absolutely nasty because they give the character a debuff that lasts for days or is even permanent. Now, one of the characters were already pretty injured from a prior battle, and on top of this, didn't have their full HP. They just couldn't get it. So it was a pretty foolhardy plan, but they were also just not expecting the enemies to be able to work together like they were. And that is something that was absolutely awesome when the players decided to move slow. Well, you had to move slow when you're unconscious, and then get up and then move fast, knowing that essentially the players were going to get 2 turns in a row before the enemies could do anything. Now, the two bridgemen on the ground, they did this, though all they could do is really recover. Now, there's a recover action, which I haven't mentioned up until this point, that can be used to give back either HP and or focus. You roll a die depending on your willpower, and then you allocate the value of that die between those two stats. They did this for HP because this was going to be a pretty terrible battle. So they stayed on the ground. They let their warrior ally do his best to kind of hold his ground between these two enemies, which were then ganging up on him because he was an armed threat, and the two bridgemen on the ground were pretty much dead to them at this point. And things were looking pretty grim, but the players were able to recover a little bit. Now, that player that went to attack the scout enemy was not expecting that scout to be also good with a melee weapon, and that player ended up going down in just 2 shots in a very little amount of time, and that created a lot of stress. So the players were struggling. Some of the enemies had taken a little bit of damage up until this point, but things needed to happen. And they did. The bridgemen who were on the ground stood up and did their best. They fought with their allies, and they watched the enemies and how they worked, and they decided to start working together. This allowed their warrior buddy and one of the bridgemen to take down one of the enemies, which enraged its war pair. In addition to this, the other bridgeman, despite being on death's doorstep, ran up to the other scout who was just regaining consciousness and fought off the enemy the best they could so that that ally could stand up and fight as well. And the other scout that was helping with the bridgeman at first moved in and was starting to do a lot more damage, especially because they had combat training, as I mentioned before, meaning they were able to consistently shoot with their bow and deal a little bit of damage to these more armored enemies. Then they pulled out their rapier and they were doing all kinds of awesome things, swapping between their bow and their rapier, attacking in both ranged and melee combat. The players were able to turn a very negative combat in their favor, mostly mechanically, though there was some narrative. They started using the gain advantage action, they started using aid actions with each other, and they started telling a story. They started using opportunities rolled through the plot die and using even the complications that may have come up just to get an edge over these enemies that were roughly the same strength as the players. By the end of the combat, one of the players said the first ideal, started glowing and became very powerful, and it was absolutely amazing. For a one-shot, for a bunch of level 1 characters, I can scarcely think of many more epic combats than we had in this last combat we did the other night. And I've been doing TTRPGs a long time, and don't get me wrong, I've definitely had some epic combats in my time, but this joins those ranks real quick. And this is just a first look into the system when we're still trying to learn the rules and get everything right. This game is awesome. It really makes you feel like your ability to tell an interesting story, to make a very cinematic combat is not only cool, but it aids you mechanically, which I absolutely love. And before I end this video, which has kind of gone on for quite a while, I really want to talk about the Radiant Paths. One of the things that I think a lot of people are going to slide off of real quick is this is not your standard high fantasy game. You're not playing wizards, sorcerers, warlocks, and you're not doing the same kind of magic-fueled combat that a lot of D&D and Pathfinder have become up until this point. But that doesn't mean that that doesn't happen. There are the Radiant Paths. Now, Radiant Paths are a kind of a lore thing, but you can roughly see them as Jedi in a way. Characters who gain these abilities to kind of manipulate the very fabric of reality in some specific ways and are able to, heal super fast, enhance their abilities, and all kinds of really crazy things. And this is where you get that really high fantasy element because the Cosmere RPG, the Stormlight especially, is a high fantasy. It's just a little bit tamer than things like D&D or Pathfinder. For instance, the Windrunners, so every particular Radiant Path, which there will be 9 of when the game finally releases, has control of 2 surges or 2 natures of the universe. The Windrunner specifically has adhesion, which is the ability to stick things to other things, and gravity, which allows them to fly in a lot of ways. But what's really cool about the Radiant Paths is their powers become skills that they can use. So when you become a Windrunner, you gain the gravity skill and adhesion skill. Now, normally you need investiture to use these, which is something I'm not necessarily going to into in this video, but you can look at it akin to focus, just a different resource pool. And if your character is invested with power, then you can do things that are incredibly awesome inside and outside of combat. I mean, flight is helpful no matter what situation you're in, really, but adhesion's also really cool, being able to stick things to other things to be used in ingenuitive ways. You can use a broom to bar a door even if there's no kind of latch for it. And it's about as limited as your imagination, but one of the most insane things with gravity is your ability to send enemies just flying off into the sky, which is very, very powerful. Now, sure, the enemies do get a chance to resist. Well, more you roll against their particular defense, whatever your ability targets. But when it succeeds, that enemy is almost screwed. Now, there are some types of enemies that are a lot more resistant to radiant powers, but a lot of just standard minion enemies or even some rival enemies will just kind of be one-shot by some of the radiant abilities. But that's a whole part of the game, and that takes into account what the GM is doing for their encounters. When players become radiant, they can take on larger groups of enemies and more powerful threats because they have more tools to deal with them in some very interesting ways. And currently, in the beta test, if you are interested in looking into it, we have a Windrunner and the Lightweaver. The Lightweaver having the ability to create illusions that can even become physical and to transform either matter or even enemies into a different form, either turning solids to gases or liquids or whatever. And they can do some very interesting things as well. And there's 7 more radiant paths we have to look forward to. But radiants are not necessarily the end all be all. It's like playing in the Star Wars RPGs. Yeah, sure, a lot of players want to play as either Sith or Jedi, but there are still the soldiers, the smugglers, and the other kind of archetypes in those systems that have their own uses. Heck, a Radiant may be powerful, but a warrior can be just technically better in combat, just because the warrior character has more skills, while Radiants are more focused on their powers. Yeah, sure, a character who can send you flying into the sky is very, very powerful. This is true. But a warrior who fights ingenuitively can get one up over on a Radiant if they're persistent enough and if they try hard enough. But more than that, the Radiant paths are not really designed for overcoming normal skill challenges. You know, a Radiant isn't necessarily better if they can transform into other people at stealth. They are great at disguising, sure, but even then, if they're terrible at acting or terrible at, everything required, even bad at getting information, they're just not going to be good as an agent at what an agent does best. And warriors, as I said, they can be really, really scary. And sure, this is a multi-path system, so Radiants can pick and choose out of the other heroic paths, kind of the things they want, but then, that's at the cost of some of their power. So it's a lot of a trade, and this is a narrative-based game, first and foremost. This is not a combat game. This is not a strategy-based game. This is a narrative-based game. The combat, which this video is talking about, is focused on that. But just because you have a Radiant in your party doesn't necessarily make other characters not as good, especially in combat, because a lot of different things can be happening in combat, and, sometimes the Radiant is going to be dealing with a more powerful enemy that they have to deal with, and the other players are going to have to keep the minions and other kind of lesser enemies off of them, or the Radiant might fall. The GM always has the ability to make the game harder by throwing in stronger enemies, by throwing in more enemies, or when the players roll complications, by making their lives hard by having something happen. Heck, a building could collapse, separating the players into 2 different areas, and now they're going to have to fend for themselves. A Radiant could be sectioned off from the rest of the party, and that struggle that they're going to go through is worth telling a story about. I love this game. I think that the combat is incredibly interesting, and I want to play more. We're actually going to be playtesting some more soon. We're going to be playing with the Radiant paths here in a little bit, and this game releasing in July is absolute agony to me. I have a strong feeling that the Cosmere RPG is going to be my favorite game moving forward, and we'll see when the full book release if that holds true. This is a really fun game for anyone who likes narrative combat. And if you watch this video for the full, nearly 50 minutes we're up to at this point, then you have to be interested in something like this too, right? You have to be super interested in a narrative-based game. And if we want more games like this, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, interact with it in some way, leave a comment, let me know your thoughts on it. And not only just my video, anyone who's making content on either the Cosmere or TTRPGs in general, we need people in the algorithm boosting us so that we can be more visible. I think a lot of people would absolutely enjoy the Cosmere RPG, and I feel like there's a lot of misconceptions about it. And honestly, a lot of people are just new to TTRPGs, and they don't really know anything outside of D&D. And I want to bring that content to them, or at least let them see that content and choose who they watch for themselves. So like videos, comment, do whatever for the algorithm. If you love TTRPGs and you want to see more from them, then it's the thing we all can do to help improve that. And heck, I'm going to be covering other games besides the Cosmere RPG as well. So if you like variety tabletop, if you like seeing more different types of games, then I think this is a channel you're very much going to find yourself at home at. But that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me. And I'll see y'all next time. Bye.